an invitation to come to Abington from Cork last February seemed an incredibly exciting prospect, and actually, truthfully, it's a place I had been hoping to come to anyway, but I'm embarrassed to say I haven't ever been here before, because I knew about Sheridan, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's time here as a child, and when that is mentioned in the literature about Uncle Silas, when people, if you find the word Abington at all, it's always a story about how he had stones thrown at him by locals as a child, and I suppose one of the things I want to get into is just how the particular landscapes and localities of the south of Ireland, Dublin, and the idea of Ireland and Irish history more generally kind of impressed themselves upon a novel such as Uncle Silas. So, as Gráinne mentioned, I'm doing a new edition of the novel for World's Classics. Hopefully this time next year I'll be back flogging copies of it. But at the moment I don't have any. So let me just get this right. Now I'm going to do a terrible thing. I never do this when I'm lecturing and tell you the plot of the novel. So look away if you still haven't read it and you want to be surprised by the ending. And one thing you'll notice very obviously as I explain the plot, I'll come to at the end. So the whole story is told through the voice and the eyes of a young, very imperiled woman named Maud. And when I teach it, students often become frustrated with Maud because a lot of things are done to her and things happen to her, and there's a kind of a passivity about her that contemporary students especially find astonishing, honestly. But she lives alone with her father, who dies, Austin Ruthin, and left to the care of her uncle Silas in Derbyshire until she comes of age. Now, there's all sorts of rumours circulating around her uncle Silas. She's curious about him, but she's a little bit nervous of him as well. And in particular, a rumour attached to Uncle Silas that he has earlier murdered, and he's in his own house, a man to whom he owed money for gambling. Whereas Maud's father, Austin, is entirely kind of a good man. Silas then plots to marry Maud to his oafish son Dudley, who it emerges is actually already married, so that doesn't work. But it's to do with the inheritance and the money. Now, Maud had not yet come of age, incredibly vulnerable in this precarious position of holding this fortune, and Silas is trying to find a way of keeping it in the family. The father and the son then conspire to murder Maud in order to inherit her fortune, the marriage plot not working out. And they bring in a French governess, Madame de la Rougière, who's terribly wicked in a kind of channeling into all the anti-French sentiment that British and Irish readers of the time would have shared. And they have a plan by which the victim is to be killed with a spiked hammer. And there's incredibly gory details about the violent murder. The plot fails. The governess is herself extremely violently murdered in Maud's place, and she escapes in the nick of time in terrified horror. And then Silas kills himself with an overdose of laudanum. And Maud goes on to live happily as the wife of Lady Ilbery, a gentleman who we've barely heard of at this point in the novel, but who's been sort of floating around the edges, and all ends well. Now, the thing I was talking about that you might notice is there's no reference to Ireland. Nothing happens in Ireland. There are no Irish characters. There's no discussion of Ireland. The entire plot takes place in Derbyshire. So to kind of think back now and work through my proposition about reading Uncle Silas as an Irish novel, which is what I want us to do, and think of it as a novel, as I say, that's connected to these landscapes, these places, that we all know. We have to just think a little bit more about who Le Fanu was in the 1830s and 40s, into the period when he wrote Uncle Silas, the kind of very strategic publishing choices he was making. Like Tina was saying, these are not kind of absolute values he holds often. This is just, he was a businessman, he was making his way. The son, we know, of course, of a Church of Ireland clergyman. So Uncle Silas, a novel about, bloodlines and inheritance, but Le Fanu himself had no huge inheritance. A bit like Bram Stoker, who was a civil servant. Often with the writers of Irish Gothic, we're talking about the kind of maybe the junior sons of the Anglo-Irish who don't have huge inheritances, and this kind of the idea of working for your money is actually really important. So he was in the 30s and 40s, despite his association with Anglo-Ireland and with a church like this one, really part of what we can think of as a sort of a first cultural renaissance of Ireland in the 1830s. When the founding of the journal The Nation, which you'll remember, you'll know about Thomas Davis and so on. And Charles Gavin Duffy, the young Irelander, described Le Fanu in the 1840s as writing to gratify the new sensation that the nation had awakened, the new sensation of nationality. And it's true, a lot of these early writings by Le Fanu are about Irish history and Irish culture. I probably don't need to say too much about why that cultural renaissance was a short-lived one in the 1830s into the 1840s, because of course the famine disastrously put a stop to this kind of burgeoning literary, quite kind of cross-cultural moment as well. Now, it does seem like a period when there wasn't so much sectarianism and there was a lot of shared enterprise. And you can see that with Le Fanu, so he can be associated with The Nation, but also with the great journal of Protestant Ireland, the Dublin University magazine, the magazine associated with Trinity College, Dublin. He began contributing to it from 1838, and he became its proprietor in 1861. Part of his portfolio of literary business practices was being proprietor of the Dublin University magazine. And the little story I told you there about a kind of short-lived cultural renaissance that leads to more hardline political identities after the famine, you can even see, if you can just make them out there, the changing covers of The Nation, the very first, of the Dublin University magazine, the very first issue of which is adorned with a round tower and a kind of familiar Celtic scene that you could see on the front of a Thomas Davis book, or indeed in The Nation itself. And thereafter, every single issue is adorned with a picture of Queen Elizabeth I, the founding monarch for Trinity College Dublin. So that kind of hard changing of identities Le Fanu is part of. But he was, in the 1830s and 40s, in the period before the famine, often writing stories set in 18th century Ireland, dealing with Irish superstitions and sensations, particularly the superstitions and sensations, superstitions and fairy stories associated with this part of Ireland. It would be actually a really fascinating topic for another one of these events to do more about that, the legends that he knew about and wrote about. But then in 1843 he married Susanna Bennett, who died very young, not too long afterwards. He wrote The Cock and the Anchor in 1845. That's a fantastic novel. It's a kind of really rollicking, merry old Dublin kind of novel, and it's the kind of novel you couldn't write anymore after the famine, because it imagines a kind of a more kind of fluid world of people being able to move between different sectors of society, and another historical novel. Then in 1863, The House by the Churchyard, a very complex murder mystery, which is not an easy read, set in Dublin, and a huge influence, as Tina already mentioned, on Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which often returns to that novel. His wife died, and he seems to then have required, and we're not really sure how, this reputation, which he partly cultivated himself, as the invisible prince of Merrion Square. So scarcely seen outside his Merrion Square home, and a figure of kind of mystery and intrigue around that. And then 1864, Uncle Silas, and he died in 1873, and he's buried there in Mount Jerome. I'm sure you've been to pay your respects in Mount Jerome. I certainly have. So what I want to do now is just to think about that particular novel, Uncle Silas, and take you through some of the kind of facts to do with some of the ways in which we can think of it as an Irish novel, despite the fact, as I said, it's entirely set in Derbyshire. And to start doing that, we have to kind of go in a little bit to the business part of Le Fanu's story. Le Fanu, the businessman, the publisher, the entrepreneur who was making a living through literature. Again, no inheritance himself, despite his interest in these plots of inheritance. And so if we dig a bit more into the detail of how and why he wrote Uncle Silas, we'll begin to see some of the things that affected his choice of a Derbyshire setting for that novel. So he published it monthly in the Dublin University magazine. This is exactly what Tina was saying. He was filling the pages with his own writing. It was cheap. He wasn't costing his own time, charging his own time at a lot. He had tried to get a London publisher interested, but that didn't work, so he went for the Dublin University magazine. And that writing it monthly is really interesting part of the story, and it gives you an indication of what a hard worker he was and how much he was kind of struggling all the time, really. I love this letter to the publisher, the English publisher who took Le Fanu's novel in the end. And he's talking about it, and he says, you know, is how you write month to month, really write a novel. So in the short part, in the July number appeared, I had not a line more written, and I was still not half recovered. He'd had a cold, and 2 days every week are consumed in claims of my time which did not allow one moment for writing this story. The last line of which I nevertheless wrote on the 3rd of this month, November, and the novel actually starts in November. It's so timely to be talking about it today because it opens actually on All Souls. And then 32 pages written, he says, written in 3 months, only 2/3 of which were applicable to the writing of the tale. I am very tired, he says, and I claim some credit for diligence. You have to think fair play, you know, to Le Fanu. So it draws on and develops an earlier Dublin University magazine story. So again, what Tina was saying, he wrote stuff and rewrote stuff. This was, which it has a lot of the plot of Uncle Silas, but it is entirely set in Ireland. So that's a help to my case, isn't it? That I can say, you know, I can look back and see that he actually readapted an Irish story for English, and so we know that for England. We know that from passage in The Secret History of an Irish Countess. But what's really interesting, and we have Bill McCormack's work to thank for this, is we know about his negotiations with the London publisher Richard Bentley, who wanted a new novel after The House by the Churchyard, of which he had taken 500 copies. That would be a good number to get out. But Bentley, when he gave Le Fanu the contract for the new novel, stipulated that it had to be, and this is what Bentley said, the story of an English subject in modern times. So he was basically saying, forget 17th century Ireland, forget 18th century Ireland, forget superstitions you've heard on the shores of Lough Gur. This has to be a modern story, an English subject in modern times. And that, of course, is just what Le Fanu gave Bentley. And we can get a bit more context for that decision from a couple of other English writers who had associations with Ireland in this time. One of them is Anthony Trollope, who famously, of course, began his writing career in Ireland. He's the great Victorian novelist, wrote, you know, quadrillions of books, but was blocked as a writer and not able to write until he was posted here for the post office, and, you know, lived in Banagher, Clonmel, Mallow, Limerick, Dublin, was all over Ireland, married an Irish wife, and published an Irish novel. And this is his publisher saying, you know, I've looked into the sales of your Irish novels, the Kellys and the O'Kellys, but in vain. The sale has been, I regret to say, so small that the loss upon the publication is very considerable. And it is evident, he goes on, that readers do not like novels on Irish subjects as well as on others. Thus you will perceive it is impossible for me to give you any more encouragement as a novelist. And Trollope, in fact, greatly advanced as a novelist, but he stopped for a long time writing about Ireland. And you might note the date of that letter, 1848. This is Harriet Martineau, an English writer very interested in political economy, and who was a journalist in Ireland, wrote accounts of Ireland. She says, the world is weary of the subject of Ireland. And above all the rest, the English reading world is weary of it. The mere name brings up images of men in long coats and women in long cloaks, of mud cabins and potatoes, the conacre, the middleman, the priest, the faction fight, the funeral howl. The sadness of the subject in late years increased the weariness. You know, you might read accounts of Egyptian famine or Defoe's account of the plague. We turn away from similar accounts in Ireland because something ought to be done for Ireland, but please don't be giving us your novels about it anymore. And clearly this is the immediate aftermath of the famine, and those are the images that Martineau is bringing to mind. And that's what was in Bentley's mind when he said to Le Fanu, people just don't want to read about Ireland, they're not buying any books about Ireland. Because we could think about it now as a kind of compassion fatigue, maybe, if we were to be generous about it. So then Uncle Silas, the Derbyshire of Uncle Silas, Derbyshire becomes a place where Le Fanu can consider the fate of great houses that have ownership is under threat, and where lineage becomes a kind of frail, imperiled thing. And that kind of emotionally, if you like, rather than materially or practically, brings us back to this precise place, which is post-famine Ireland now. And so Le Fanu finds ways of threading, and Tina talked about how with Irish Gothic we often have to make leaps of imagination to make connections. This is how Roy Foster talks about it. He says Irish landlords were bound for the dust heap of history long before the combined efforts of Parnell, Davitt, Captain Moonlight and Gladstone finally precipitated them there. And what he's talking about really is the process that began after the famine in Irish history of the kind of undoing of the great landed estates. So obviously the Irish Revolution did its work there, but Foster is saying even before that, the encumbered estates courts after the famine, you might remember hearing about those before, where they began the kind of breaking up of the big estates. And that is the landscape that Le Fanu knows about and is thinking about, with where inheritance now is imagined as something very frail. Big houses are always in danger. They may not continue. These are just contemporary accounts of the Encumbered Estates Act, the kind of the great sale off of the big estates, satirically imagined here as a heroic Irish landlord closing his door in the cabin and leaving, getting out of Ireland. And the classic account of this actually comes from Friedrich Engels writing a letter to Karl Marx. Engels was in Manchester in the 1850s, and he came over to Ireland. And he says landowners who, everywhere else he means in England, are becoming kind of more bourgeois, are here reduced to complete poverty. Their country seats are surrounded by enormous, amazingly beautiful parks, but all around is wasteland. And where the money is to come from, anyone, it's impossible to see. These fellows are droll enough, these are the Anglo-Irish landlords, to make your sides burst with laughing. And there's a description of them. They're all laden with debts, and they all live in dread of the Encumbered Estates Act. And that kind of thinking of Le Fanu as finding a different way of writing about an imperiled, vanishing Anglo-Ireland is picked up by a couple of writers in the 1940s. So Le Fanu turned to writing about Ireland via Derbyshire in the immediate aftermath of the famine. And it's then, interestingly, in London, in the context of the Second World War, that writers began to kind of remake Uncle Silas as an Irish novel. And the first one to do that was V.S. Pritchett, the British writer who came to Ireland as a journalist just as the Civil War started, actually, reporting for the Christian Science Monitor, interestingly enough, and wrote about Ireland, Le Fanu later. And he said what Le Fanu did was to bring an Irish lucidity and imagination to what he called the turgid German flow of Gothic. Le Fanu's ghosts are what I take to be the most disquieting of all, the ghosts that can be justified, blobs of the unconscious that have floated up in the mind. And that's one of the reasons Le Fanu is really famous in the global history of Gothic, is because he gives you ghosts who might just be about happen, might be just believable. It's a supernatural that always stays on the edge of possibility. And Pritchett went on, he's writing from an Anglo-Irish society that Pritchett said is the most charming in the British Isles, a charming society, a guilty society. And he finds all of that guilt in Le Fanu. And then the classic exploration of this comes from Elizabeth Bowens' writing, the Anglo-Irish novelist and pioneer modernist writers who wrote an edition for Uncle Silas, not for World's Classics, that's wrong, for Cresset, as Tina said. I must have had World's Classics on the brain, and actually drove up through, I came from Cork this morning, through Mallow and Buttevant and so on, and it does feel like you come through a kind of a shared landscape of domains and parkland that has now been kind of remade in different ways, coming from North Cork through through into Limerick. And when Bowens wrote her introduction to Uncle Silas, Sheridan Le Fanu's Uncle Silas, she absolutely called it as Irish. She didn't sort of pussyfoot around it. She says, I'm drawn to the story, she says, because the author was Irish. And she talks about his great lineage, Sheridan the dramatist, or rather she says Anglo-Irish. And Uncle Silas has always struck me as being an Irish story transposed to an English setting. And this is her rather kind of cryptic description. The hermetic solitude and the autocracy of the great country house, and that is kind of Maud's experience in Derbyshire, is locked inside this house. The demonic power of the family myth, and that is true of, what is the story about the family? Fatalism, feudalism, and the ascendancy outlook are accepted facts of life for the race of hybrids, she means the Anglo-Irish, from which Le Fanu sprang. For the psychological background of Uncle Silas, it was necessary for him to invent nothing. And she also picks up in particular on his choice of the north of England as a location on Derbyshire, where she says, up there in the vast estates of landed old stock, there still appeared in the years when Le Fanu wrote a time lag as in a more marked form separates Ireland from England more effectually than any sea. And she goes on with these even more curious remarks about Uncle Silas as a novel that's Irish in two other ways. It's sexless, she says. So we have the kind of vamped up, sexy Carmilla, and Bowens saying that Uncle Silas is sexless. And she says that nothing runs into the channel of sexual feeling in the novel, and she finds that peculiarly Irish. That's like discuss for that. And then I just have two more things to say, and I'm going to conclude then. So taking you through this kind of, I suppose, speculative exercise in thinking of this Derbyshire novel by our Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu as an Irish novel. One curious detail that has always struck me in the novel is that it's a particular obsession with trees and with planting. I think of that, the lines from the Austin Clarke poem, the house of the planter is known by the trees. And there seems to be something in Le Fanu's imagination about trees and plantations that works its way into Uncle Silas, where the questions of forestation and deforestation, the deforestation of Ireland from the Cromwellian period onwards, which is such a kind of trope still in nationalist memory of the plantations of Ireland, is not an English story, if you like, but it's one that Le Fanu brings into Uncle Silas. He describes, there's a good cousin in the novel, cousin Monica, and her house is described as having that indescribable air of shelter and comfort which belongs to an old English residence, with old timber grouped around it. And he imagines the trees speaking, saying, come in, be at rest here. And one of the times in the novel that we figure out that things are really going to the bad is when we hear that Uncle Silas is going to Maud's inheritance and some of the forest she's inherited and cutting down the trees. And he's taking the timber too early, and he's not replanting it and allowing a kind of a natural growth because he needs the money to settle his debts. And that kind of unnatural early cutting of the timber is part of what makes him so evil in the novel. It underpins a description of absenteeism, which we find in Mariah Edgeworth's novel, The Absentee, about the classic issue of Anglo-Irish absenteeism, where one character says to the other, that you shouldn't be cutting down the trees in your estate. You're doing it, for a single season in London, to afford parties in London. The growth of a century is swallowed in the entertainments of one winter. Our hills to be bare for another half century to come. Does anyone know where that picture is? If you think about the cutting down of the trees, you might guess. Kilcash, yeah, it's Kilcash. So, the whole Cadhíon Mid Fasta Gan Imid, I think image and thought is there for Le Fanu. So I just have one final thing to say, and it's about Abington itself. So I've been, as I say, engaging in these speculations about how to make Uncle Silas an Irish novel. And I mentioned the story that's often told in the criticism about him having stones thrown at him as a child. It's true that in the period that the Le Fanus were here in Abington, this part of Ireland, the south of Ireland, which people said then in the way that we sometimes would say until recently, the north of Ireland, people talked about the south of Ireland as a kind of a byword for agrarian violence and for danger. And there is a map in the British Library showing this whole Munster, basically, with showing kind of outbreaks of agrarian violence, and Rockite violence in particular, mapped onto absentee landowners and showing the connection. And it was made to be shown to the king to kind of make the point to him. And I don't know whatever happened to it, but the map survives. So I suppose what I'm saying is, to be a reader of Sheridan Le Fanu's Uncle Silas is to engage, yes, in the work of criticism and analysis. And if I was teaching it in UCC, I'd be making you do a lot more reading of all the individual passages and thinking about the narrative and so on. But it's also to engage in a kind of work of an imagination, a kind of historical imagination, and to take that invitation and work and to go with Le Fanu is to return you to landscapes such as this one in really important ways. So thank you.